The sound was a thin, metallic screech. It was the only sound in the Chicago attic apartment, save for the November wind rattling the dirty glass. Elias Thorne stared at the tool in his hand. It wasn't a knife. It was a 6-inch pointing trowel, the kind a master bricklayer used for fine mortar work. He was very carefully prying up the third floorboard from the left, next to the dead radiator. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead, betraying the icy chill in the room. He'd shut the gas off himself. For good. The board popped free with a dry crack. Elias closed his eyes, praying. Not to God. He and God had stopped speaking long ago. He was praying to whatever remained of luck, of cosmic chance, that he had miscounted, that there was more. He reached into the dark, shallow space. His fingers, once his trade, precise and strong, capable of laying a perfect line of brick, were now swollen and stiff, knotted by an early aggressive arthritis. They were the claws of a man who had outlived his own utility. They brushed against a tin box. He pulled it out, an old decorative cookie tin. Inside, a few crumpled fives and a spray of loose change. He dumped it onto the floor. $78.41. Despair is not a tidal wave. It is a slow, rising freeze. It was the creeping, crushing realization that he was, officially, empty. The money for Mary's treatments, the money for the funeral, and then the rent for the last 6 months as his hands failed him, as the work dried up, as the man who built walls for a living found himself completely boxed in. It was all here. $78. Elias didn't move. He just breathed. The exhale was shaky. Across the room, the landlord, a man named Kretschmar, all belly and sour breath, was pounding on the door. The sound was a violation. Thorne, it's the first. Open up. Elias didn't answer. He'd promised the money, a lie. The last in a long line of lies bought to stall for time he couldn't use. I know you're in there, Thorne. You got 24 hours or the sheriff's hauling you out. You hear me? The street. The heavy footsteps retreated down the stairs. The silence that returned was heavier than before. The street, in November, in Chicago, was $78. Elias looked around the empty room. Mary's things were gone, sold. His things were gone, sold. All that remained was the cot, her one threadbare armchair, and his tools, worthless to anyone else. Artifacts of a dead life. And then a movement. From under the armchair, a small, wiry shadow emerged. It was Scrap, a runt of the litter terrier mix Mary had brought home from the shelter, against all his protests. He was absurdly small, brindle-coated, with one ear that refused to stand. Elias had never wanted him. After Mary passed, he could barely feed himself, let alone another mouth. Scrap let out a low, pathetic whine. He was hungry. Elias hadn't eaten in 2 days. Neither had the dog. Elias stared at the change on the floor. $78. Enough for a one-way bus ticket to nowhere. Enough for the strongest bottle of whiskey in the corner store. Enough to forget. Scrap whined again. And then he did something. The small dog, shivering from cold and hunger, walked slowly forward. He nudged the dirty, well-chewed rubber knot, his only toy, directly onto the pile of money. He looked up at Elias, his brown eyes holding an absolute, unshakable faith. An offering. My only possession for your attention. It was an unexpected, profound act of kindness in the abyss of his despair. Elias looked at the dog. The dog looked back. And something inside the calloused, broken man finally shattered. He couldn't save his wife. He couldn't save his job. He couldn't save his home. But maybe, just maybe, he could save this one, stupid creature. You're an idiot, you know that, Elias whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He scooped up the pile of money, shoving it into the pocket of his one remaining jacket, and pulled himself to his feet. His knees cracked in protest. He whistled, a low, breathy sound. Come on, Scrap. Scrap's tail gave a single, hopeful thump. 15 minutes later, Elias was in the corner convenience store. The air smelled of old hot dogs and burnt coffee. He stood in front of the pet aisle. He held a small bag of dog food, $11. It felt like theft. And then he saw it. He wasn't looking for it. It was just there, tacked to the community bulletin board, sandwiched between flyers for lost cats and a cleaning service. It was a sloppily typed notice. Caretaker needed. Elias would have ignored it. But there was a photo, grainy and black and white. It was a massive, almost ruinous, Gothic-style house. It looked like something from a horror movie. Below the picture, the text, "Winter caretaker needed for the Blackwood Manor on Haven Island, Maine. Includes basic grounds and systems maintenance. Must remain on site. Harsh winter. No ferry service from December to April. Room and board provided. Contact Creed and Finch, attorneys at law. Haven Island, Maine." It was the coldest, most isolated, most final-sounding place he could imagine. A voluntary prison, a place to disappear. It was a sudden, massive opportunity, and it was impossible. Basic maintenance. His hands couldn't even hold a hammer properly. He started to turn away. Then he stopped. He read it again. Room and board provided. And then at the very bottom, a line scrawled in pen. "Predecessor left due to loneliness. Pets welcome. We don't care, as long as you stay. A secret waiting." Why did the predecessor really leave? The payphone in the corner of the store seemed to call to him. Elias looked down at Scrap, who sat patiently by his boot. He looked at the $11 bag of dog food. He put the dog food back on the shelf. He walked to the register, broke one of his last $5 bills for a handful of quarters, and moved to the payphone. He lifted the heavy, cold plastic receiver. Scrap whined, nervous at the separation. Elias looked back, and for the first time in months, he put his hand on the dog's head, scratching the one floppy ear. The dog leaned into the touch as if it were sunlight. It was the magic of loyalty, a creature that could be starved, ignored, and forgotten, and still choose without question to love. "It's okay, kid," Elias mumbled, a new unfamiliar resolve in his voice. "We're not going to freeze. Not yet." He turned back to the phone, feeding the first quarter into the slot. "Yes," he said, his voice finding a strength he thought was long dead. "I'm calling about the caretaker ad. My name is Elias Thorne." The phone call ended. Elias Thorne stood in the tomb-like silence of the convenience store, the receiver still cold against his ear. The voice on the other end, a clipped, emotionless tenor, hadn't asked about his hands. It hadn't asked for references. It had simply said, "A ticket has been wired to the Greyhound station in your name. A car service will take you from Bangor to the coast. Be on the 7:00 p.m. bus, tonight." Elias hung up the phone. He had 4 hours. He bought the $11 bag of dog food. It felt like an anchor, the only solid decision he'd made in a year. Getting out of the apartment was a tactical operation. He moved with a speed his aching joints shouldn't have possessed. He packed one canvas duffel bag. It didn't take long. 3 changes of clothes, his shaving kit, Mary's picture in its cheap silver frame, and wrapped in an old oilcloth, the tools he couldn't bear to sell, his pointing trowel, a brick hammer, and a worn-down spirit level. They were useless to him as a worker, but they were the only proof he'd ever been one. Scrap, sensing the urgent shift in atmosphere, stayed glued to his ankle. He heard Kretschmar, the landlord on the floor below, yelling at another tenant about a bounced check. Elias didn't hesitate. He didn't take the main stairs. He took the fire escape. The metal rungs were slick with ice, screaming in protest as his weight settled on them. Each step sent a spike of pain from his ankles to his knees. He moved down, flight by flight, the sleeping city sprawling before him under the toxic orange glow of the streetlights. Scrap was tucked inside his jacket, a small, warm, trembling weight against his ribs. He dropped the last 10 feet, landing hard on the pavement of the alley. The impact sent a shockwave up his spine, forcing a sharp exhale. He didn't look back. He just walked toward the blue and white sign of the Greyhound station. The terminal was a circle of hell Dante had forgotten to write about. It smelled of stale coffee, diesel fumes, and unwashed bodies. It was the great gray crossroads of the desperate and the transient. People slept on the hard plastic chairs, mouths open, clutching their meager possessions. Elias blended in perfectly. The ticket was waiting just as the voice had said. "Thorne, Elias, one way, Bangor, Maine." The woman at the counter, her face worn down by 1,000 similar transactions, glanced at the small head peeking out of his jacket. "No pets," she said, reciting a line she'd said 10,000 times. "He's a support animal," Elias replied, his voice flat. He forced his knotted hand, the one that shook the most, to retrieve the ticket. He held it out. The ticket agent looked at his hand, then at his hollow eyes. She saw a man who wasn't trying to scam the system. She saw a man who was one bad day away from shattering. She sighed, the sound of institutional pity. Keep him quiet. She stamped the ticket. The bus ride was 38 hours of vibrating non-reality. They moved from the flat grid of the Midwest into the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, then up through the dense, dark forests of New England. Elias didn't sleep. He watched America slide by in a blur of truck stops, bare trees, and forgotten factories. Scrap slept in his lap, a knot of unconditional trust. Elias, meanwhile, felt a cold dread settle in his gut. This wasn't a job. It was an extraction. They hadn't hired him. They had claimed him. The law firm Creed and Finch hadn't cared who he was, only that he was. He was a warm body to fill a cold house, a plug to stop a leak. They arrived in Bangor just after dawn. The promised car service was a beat-up Ford Taurus, driven by a kid who looked like he was skipping high school. They drove another 2 hours, heading east, the landscape growing harsher. The trees thinned, replaced by granite and scrub pine. The air changed. The smell of diesel and earth was scoured away by the clean, brutal scent of salt and low tide. The kid dropped him at a commercial fishing pier in a town called Port Clyde. It was less a town than a collection of shingled houses clinging stubbornly to a granite cliff. The harbor was a gray, choppy expanse. "He'll be here," the kid said, gesturing to the empty dock. "Gus, he's the only one who runs to Haven." The kid sped off, leaving Elias and Scrap alone on the pier. The wind was different here. It wasn't the blunt force of a Chicago gust. It was a surgeon's blade, wet and sharp, cutting through his thin jacket. After 20 minutes, a lobster boat, the Tidewitch, chugged into view. It was a battered, working vessel. A man in yellow oilskin overalls, his face weathered into a permanent squint, threw a rope over a piling. He didn't get off the boat. He just stared at Elias. "You the one," the man, Gus, called over the thrum of the engine. "Elias Thorne, for Blackwood Manor," Gus grunted. "Figured. Get on." Elias grabbed his duffel and stepped onto the heaving deck. The boat smelled powerfully of diesel, fish, and the iron tang of the sea. Gus immediately cast off. "Dog stays quiet?" "He stays quiet," Elias said. Scrap had already crawled back inside his jacket, shivering. The crossing took 40 minutes. The mainland dissolved into a gray mist behind them. The boat pitched and rolled, fighting the swell. Elias's hands, gripping the wet railing, were rigid claws of pure agony. The cold sea spray felt like needles. "You the only one?" Gus yelled over the engine. "What? The only one who called?" "Figured the lawyers would have sent a few. They're getting desperate." "What happened to the last one?" Elias shouted back. Gus seemed to consider the question, or perhaps the wind just stole his words. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the churning water. He didn't like the cold. "That's all?" Gus turned, his eyes the same color as the water. "Kid was from Florida, said the house made noises. They all say that. It's an island, Thorne. Wind hits the cliffs, it howls. House is old, it settles. You put too much stock in noises, you go crazy." He pointed. "There she is." Elias looked. It emerged from the fog like a bad dream. Haven Island. It wasn't a gentle, sandy place. It was a jagged tooth of dark granite rising from the sea, and perched at its highest point, skeletal against the bruised sky, was Blackwood Manor. It was a massive, dark silhouette of sharp angles and chimney stacks. Scrap inside Elias's coat let out a low, terrified whine that Elias had never heard before. The boat didn't head for the house. It rounded the point to a small, protected cove with a single rotting dock. Gus expertly nudged the Tidewitch against the pilings. "This is it," Gus said, cutting the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, filled only by the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. "Keys are under a busted lobster trap by the back door," Gus said, all business. "Pantry's stocked. Generators in the shed. Diesel tank is full. Don't let it run empty, or you'll never get it primed again till spring." Elias grabbed his bag. "You're not coming up?" Gus laughed, a short barking sound. "Hell no. I drop. I don't stay. My contract's with Creed and Finch, not with whatever's in that house." He tossed Elias's duffel bag onto the dock. Elias stepped off the boat. The dock timbers felt unstable under his feet. "Gus," Elias said, a new, sharp unease cutting through his exhaustion. "What does that mean?" "Whatever's in that house." Gus was already reversing the engine. "Means the last guy, the kid from Florida? He didn't leave because of the cold, Thorne. The boat was already 10 feet away. He left because he swore something on the island wouldn't let him sleep. Gus put the throttle forward. Last ferry till April, mister. Hope you're a heavy sleeper. The Tide Witch turned and aimed for the mainland, its engine noise fading fast, leaving Elias Thorne and his dog on the dock. The sun was a weak smear in the west. The path up to the house was a dark tunnel cut through overgrown, skeletal trees. And from the high cliffs, as the wind picked up, Elias thought he heard it. Not a settling groan, not the howl of wind. It sounded for just a second like a voice. The Tide Witch's engine noise was the last piece of the 21st century. It faded until it was just a memory, swallowed by the rising wind and the rhythmic, percussive crash of waves against the granite cliffs. Elias Thorne stood on the rotting dock, a solitary figure in the deepening twilight. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was immense. It was a physical weight. Scrap, shivering, pushed his nose against Elias's hand, a small, desperate plea for reassurance he didn't feel. "All right, kid," Elias breathed, his words stolen by the wind. "One foot in front of the other." He slung the duffel bag over his shoulder. The weight, though minimal, sent a sharp, arthritic protest up his neck. He gripped the strap with his good hand, his knuckles already white and stiff from the damp cold. The path from the dock was not a path. It was a scar cut decades ago into the hillside, ascending steeply through a tunnel of black, skeletal spruce and pine. The branches, stripped bare by the salt and wind, clicked together like bones. The climb was agony. Elias was a bricklayer, a man used to gravity and load, but his body was a traitor. Each step on the uneven, rocky trail was a negotiation with his knees. His breath plumed in front of him, ragged and thin. Halfway up, he had to stop, leaning against a granite boulder slick with moss. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. He was a man of measurements, of levels, of plumb lines. But as he stood there gasping in the frigid air, he could not shake the feeling that the island was watching him. Scrap felt it too. The dog didn't explore. He didn't sniff the new strange smells. He stayed glued to Elias's boot, his body low, his tail tucked. When they broke the tree line, the house was waiting. Blackwood Manor was not a house. It was a judgment. Built from the same dark granite as the island itself, it seemed to have been pulled from the earth rather than built upon it. It was a severe, joyless piece of Gothic revival architecture, all steep gables, sharp angles, and a single central tower that stabbed at the bruised purple sky. The windows were voids, black mirrors reflecting nothing. It loomed. It was the only word for it. It leaned into the wind, absorbing the gale and giving nothing back but silence. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Elias whispered, a phrase he'd inherited from his mother, used only in moments of true awe or true horror. This was both. Scrap stopped dead 20 yards from the back porch, a low, guttural whine starting in his chest. "Come on!" Elias tugged the dog's makeshift rope leash. Scrap refused, planting his feet. "We don't have a choice, boy. It's this or that." He gestured to the churning, indifferent sea. He half-dragged the trembling dog to the rear of the manor. The back door was a heavy, plank-wood affair, tucked into an alcove, and just as Gus the ferryman had said, a busted, weathered lobster trap sat beside it. Elias nudged it with his boot. Underneath, a single, heavy iron key rested on a hook. He picked it up. It was cold, so cold it burned his fingers. Elias, a man who had built structures designed to last centuries, ran a hand over the doorframe. The joinery was perfect. The house was settling, as Gus had said, but it was settling into eternity. It would be here long after he was gone. He put the key in the lock. The click of the tumblers turning was offensively loud, an intrusion on the island's long-held quiet. He pushed the door. It swung open on well-oiled hinges. No creak, no groan. The first thing that hit him was the smell. It was not the smell of decay. It was not dust or mold or rats. It was the clean antiseptic smell of lemon oil and bleach. Elias stepped into the darkness of the kitchen. Scrap balked at the threshold, refusing to cross. "Get in, dog," Elias commanded, his voice sharp with a new, specific dread. He nudged the dog over the line with his boot. He fumbled on the wall, his swollen fingers finding a modern plastic switch plate. He flicked it. Nothing. "Generator," he muttered, remembering Gus's words. He found the generator shed attached to the kitchen, a lean-to built for a more modern age. The diesel generator itself was a massive, industrial-grade piece of machinery. The fuel gauge was full. He followed the instructions printed on a laminated card, hit the primer, and flipped the ignition. The machine roared to life with a deep, shuddering thrum. Back in the kitchen, Elias hit the switch again. The lights, long, yellow fluorescent tubes, flickered, buzzed, and then flooded the room with a sickly, sulfurous light. The kitchen was spotless. The black and white tiled floor was clean enough to eat off. The massive cast iron stove was polished. The butcher block counters were scrubbed bare. Elias opened a cabinet. Canned goods, dozens of them, all neatly stacked, labels facing forward. He opened the pantry. It was the same. Bags of rice, flour, sugar, coffee, all in sealed, rodent-proof containers. The law firm Creed and Finch had not been lying. The place was stocked. But this wasn't the work of a delivery service. This was meticulous, obsessive. This was the work of someone with nothing but time and a desperate need for order. It was the cleanest, most unsettling room Elias had ever been in. He dropped his duffel bag by the door. His body was screaming for rest. He found the dog's food, ripped the bag open with his teeth because his fingers wouldn't obey, and dumped a pile onto a piece of newspaper. Scrap fell upon it, the sound of his eating echoing in the sterile space. Caretaker's quarters, Elias said to himself, scanning the doors off the kitchen. One led to the main dining hall, a vast dark pit he was not yet ready to explore. The other led to a small, simple room. It contained a narrow cot, a single wooden desk, a chair, and a small empty wardrobe. Like the kitchen, it was sterile. The cot was made with military precision. Elias sat on the edge of the cot, the thin mattress groaning under his weight. He was finally terribly alone. He looked at the desk. He was a pragmatic man. He needed to know what he was facing. He pulled open the top drawer. Empty. The second. Empty. The bottom drawer was stuck. He grunted, pulling on it, but the wood had swollen. A flash of irritation, his one constant companion, rose in him. He unhooked the trowel from his tool bag. He slid the thin, strong steel into the gap, leveraging his weight. The drawer popped open. It was empty. No, not empty. Elias squinted. At the very back of the drawer, a single tiny object glinted in the yellow light. He reached in, his thick fingers fumbling. He scooped it out. It was a single bead, dark and smooth, from a broken rosary. Elias, a man who hadn't set foot in a church in 20 years, rolled the bead between his thumb and forefinger. A cold, hard knot formed in his stomach. He was about to toss it back when he felt something else. Taped to the underside of the drawer, hidden from view, was a piece of paper. He ripped it free. It was a small laminated pharmacy label, torn from a prescription bottle. The name of the patient and the doctor were scratched out with a black permanent marker. All that remained was the warning, printed in stark red letters. Caution, may cause insomnia. Do not operate heavy machinery. Elias stared at the label, then at the rosary bead in his other hand. From the kitchen, Scrap's frantic eating suddenly stopped. Elias went rigid. He heard it too. The dog was standing at the other door, the one leading to the black void of the main house. A low, continuous growl rumbled in his chest, a sound Elias had never heard him make. Scrap wasn't growling at the dark. He was growling at the sound coming from the dark, the faint, unmistakable sound of a single heavy footstep on the floorboard directly above them. The growl was not a warning. It was a statement of fact. Elias Thorne froze, his hand still inside the desk drawer, fingers closed around the single rosary bead. The sound from above, that one definitive, heavy-shod footstep, hung in the air, an echo that refused to fade. Scrap stood rigid, hackles raised, staring at the pitch-black doorway that led to the main house. The dog's low, vibrating growl was the only thing challenging the generator's mechanical thrum. Elias's first instinct was not fear. It was rage, a cold, sharp anger that burned through the fog of his exhaustion. Someone was in the house. He wasn't a caretaker. He was a victim. He'd been lured to this rock to be robbed, or worse. He dropped the bead and the label onto the desk. He stood, his joints screaming in protest, but he ignored them. He was no longer a patient. He was a cornered man. He moved to his duffel bag, his steps deliberate. He unrolled the oilcloth. His hands, though swollen and stiff, found the familiar shape. He wrapped his fingers around the hickory handle of his brick hammer. It was a Est-wing, 22-ounce, solid steel. It was perfectly balanced. It was an extension of his arm. He had used it to build walls, to shape stone. Now he weighed its potential to shatter bone. "Stay," he whispered to Scrap. The dog didn't move, his eyes fixed on the darkness. Elias flicked the kitchen light switch. The fluorescent tubes died, plunging the room into darkness, save for the weak moonlight filtering through the grimy windows. He didn't want to be a target. He wanted to be the shadow. He walked to the doorway of the main house. The air that poured out of it was different. The kitchen, heated by the generator's proximity, was cold. The main house was a deep, penetrating ice. It smelled of dust, old money, and the sea. He crossed the threshold. His boots were loud on the hardwood floor of the main hall. He paused, listening. Only the generator, only the wind. He took a breath, held it, and listened again. Nothing. The footstep had come from above. He faced the grand staircase. It was a monster, a spine of dark carved mahogany that ascended into a blacker void. Elias was a pragmatist. He couldn't sleep in a house with an intruder. He couldn't barricade himself in the kitchen forever. He had to clear the house. It was his job. It was his property for now. He took the first step. The wood was cold, solid, and silent. The builders had known their trade. The stair didn't creak. He ascended, the brick hammer held low, his thumb on the flashlight app of his phone. But he didn't turn it on. Not yet. He reached the landing. A long, dark hallway stretched in both directions, a gallery of closed doors. The air was so still he could hear the blood in his own ears. Thud. He flinched. The sound. It came again. Not a footstep. A thud. It was close. He thumbed the flashlight. A bright white cone of LED light cut the darkness. He aimed it. The hallway was empty. Dust motes danced in the beam. He aimed the light at the doors, all closed. Thud. It came from the room at the end of the hall, the third door on the right. Elias moved, his back sliding along the wall, a technique he hadn't known he remembered. He reached the door. It was heavy oak. The brass knob was cold. He listened, silence. He raised the hammer, took a breath, and used his shoulder to push the door open. It swung inward, scraping slightly on the floor. He snapped the light on. The room was a bedroom. It was large, dominated by a heavy four-poster bed. Like the kitchen, it was obsessively clean. The bed was made. The furniture was draped in white dust covers. Thud. He whipped the light toward the sound. On the floor next to the nightstand lay a heavy, leather-bound King James Bible. It was open, its pages splayed. As he watched, a gust of wind, a sudden, impossible downdraft from the chimney flue, lifted a page. The book shifted, and the heavy cover thudded against the hardwood floor. Elias stared. He lowered the hammer. A draft, a simple draft. The wind, as Gus had said. It had pushed the book off the nightstand. The single footstep he'd heard was the initial fall. The thuds were the wind playing with the cover. He felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. He was alone. He was just a tired old man in a noisy old house. He let out a breath he felt he'd been holding since he left Chicago. Stupid, he muttered to himself. He shined the light on the Bible. It had fallen open to the Psalms. He was about to nudge it with his boot when he saw the rosary bead on the floor next to it. It was identical to the one in the drawer downstairs. He knelt, the pain in his knees immediate and sharp. He looked at the nightstand, the insomnia label, the rosary bead. Now this. The last caretaker, the kid from Florida, had clearly been a believer, and a bad sleeper. Elias felt a pang of something like pity. The kid had probably sat here, reading this book, trying to pray away the loneliness and the noise. His flashlight beam traced the floor, and then he saw it. It wasn't the book, it wasn't the wind. By the window, away from the draft, the hardwood floor was scarred. They were not accidental scratches. Someone had been here, in this room, for a very long time, with a very sharp object. He crawled over, his light fixed on the markings. Someone had carved words into the floor, not in one place, but over and over, in a frantic, overlapping script. It was the same word, repeated 100 times. Don't sleep, don't. Elias's blood went cold. This was not the work of a man dealing with a noisy house. This was the work of a man losing his mind. This was terror. He scrambled to his feet, the pain in his knees forgotten. He backed out of the room, his hammer held high. He didn't turn his back. He pulled the door shut, the click of the latch feeling final. He walked fast, back down the hall, down the stairs. He did not run. He was a tradesman, and running was a waste of energy. But he moved with a purpose he had not felt in years. He re-entered the kitchen. Scrap was exactly where he'd left him, a statue of terrified loyalty. Elias turned, facing the door to the main house. He looked at the knob. There was no lock on his side. He was in the servants' quarters. This door was designed to be locked from the other side, to keep the help in. Not tonight, Elias said, his voice a low growl of his own. He was a man who built things. He would build a barrier. He grabbed one of the heavy wooden kitchen chairs. He dragged it to the door, wedging the back of it under the knob. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. A strong push would move it. He went to his tool bag. He took out his hammer and a handful of 16-penny nails he always kept in a side pocket. He went back to the chair. He kicked the legs, splaying them for stability on the linoleum floor. Then with 3 efficient, powerful strikes, a sound that echoed his past life, he drove the first nail through the wooden leg of the chair and deep into the floorboards below. Bang! 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 Scrap jumped, startled by the violence. Elias moved to the next leg. Bang! 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 It was a crude, brutal, desperate act. It was the work of a man sealing his own tomb. He didn't care. He was a bricklayer. He knew how to build a wall. When he was finished, the chair was an immovable object, nailed to the floor, bracing the door shut. He had created his barricade. He stepped back, breathing hard, his hands throbbing. He had separated himself from the house. He was safe. He slumped onto his cot, the hammer still in his hand, and stared at his work. The generator thrummed rhythmically. And then from beneath his feet, from the stone foundations, from the cold earth of the island itself, he felt a single, slow vibration. A tremor, as if something impossibly heavy had just shifted its weight in the cellar below. The tremor was not a sound. It was a pressure wave, a low-frequency shove that came up through the soles of his boots and rattled his teeth. It was one single slow pulse, as if the island's granite heart had just given a heavy, reluctant beat. Elias sat on the cot, frozen, the brick hammer still heavy in his hand. His eyes darted to the chair he had nailed to the floor. The door was still. The barricade was intact. Scrap, however, had gone rigid. The dog's low, territorial growl, which had been aimed at the main house door, died in his throat. He let out a single, high-pitched yipe of pure, unadulterated terror. He scrambled backwards, his claws clicking on the linoleum, and wedged his small, trembling body under the cot, behind Elias's legs. The generator's thrum was constant, a rhythm he could count. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This new thing, this was not the generator. Elias was a man who understood foundations. He understood load and stress and the properties of stone. A house this old, built on solid granite, didn't just vibrate. Not like that. His first rational thought, the generator shed. A fuel line clog, a misfire, a seizing piston. The generator was his life. It was the only thing standing between him and the sub-zero wind howling outside. He was on his feet, ignoring the fire in his knees, and moving to the shed. He unlatched the connecting door, and the full mechanical roar of the diesel engine washed over him. He stood in the small, concrete-walled space, bathed in the oily heat of the machine. He put his good hand on the engine block. The vibration was steady, powerful, and utterly familiar. The fuel lines were clear, the exhaust was clean, the machine was perfect. The tremor had not come from here. He stepped back into the kitchen, his heart, which he had thought long dead to surprise, hammering a cold, fast rhythm. The generator was in the shed. The kitchen was on a slab. The tremor had come from beneath the slab. His eyes scanned the floor, the spotless, black and white linoleum. It was clean, obsessive, perfect, except in the far corner. Tucked away between the pantry and the ancient, disconnected stovepipe was a section of floor that didn't quite match, and on it, half hidden, lay a small braided rag rug. The one single, human, homey touch in the entire sterile house. The previous caretaker, the kid from Florida, had been here. He had scrubbed every surface, polished every knob, but he had left this rug. Elias approached it. He nudged it with his boot. Underneath, set flush with the floor, was a heavy cast-iron ring, a trapdoor. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had barricaded the wrong door. He had spent the last 10 minutes nailing a chair to the floor, sealing himself in with the very thing he was trying to keep out. The main house wasn't the threat. The house was just a house. The foundation was the problem. He knelt, his joints screaming. As he got closer to the floor, a new smell cut through the sterile bleach and lemon oil. It was the smell of the dock, but magnified, concentrated. It was the smell of the deep ocean, of crushing primordial cold. And underneath that, something else. The sharp, coppery tang of old rust, or old blood. Elias put his fingers, the gnarled, useless ones, into the iron ring. He pulled. It didn't budge. It was impossibly heavy, sealed by time or pressure. He grunted, planting his boots. This was a direct, physical challenge. This he understood. He wasn't a man of intellect. He was a man of leverage. He put his full, waning strength into it. "Come on, you bastard," he hissed. His knuckles turned white. His shoulders burned. With a groan of protesting wood and a shriek of metal on stone, the seal broke. He fell back as the heavy slate-lined door swung upward, crashing against the pantry wall. It opened onto blackness. A heavy, damp, fungal cold poured out of the hole, washing over his face, extinguishing the kitchen's small warmth. From under the cot, Scrap began to whine, a high, piercing sound of absolute panic. Elias grabbed his phone from the desk and thumbed the flashlight. He pointed the white LED beam into the abyss, a set of steep, narrow stairs carved not from wood, but from the same black granite as the island, descended into the earth. He retrieved his brick hammer. He was the caretaker. "Basic grounds and systems maintenance," the ad had said. This was a system. "Stay," he commanded the dog, his voice a harsh rasp. He didn't know if he was talking to Scrap or to himself. He put his boot on the first step. It was slick with a fine, damp mist. He began to descend. The generator's thrum faded above him, replaced by a new sound. A low, liquid drip. 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 Somewhere in the dark. The air grew heavier, colder. The smell of copper and salt was overwhelming. He was no longer in a house, he was in a tomb. He reached the bottom. The floor was uneven, natural stone. The beam from his phone light was tiny, swallowed by the immense dark space. He was in a vast, hand-carved cavern under the house. The walls wept with seawater. He played the light across the darkness, and it landed on the source. It was not a furnace. It was not a cistern. In the exact center of the cavern, bolted to the granite floor with massive iron rivets, was a machine. It was Victorian, a Lovecraftian nightmare of cast iron and brass. A massive 10-foot diameter flywheel connected to a complex series of pistons, gears, and shafts. It was a relic, an impossible piece of 19th century industrial power. It was silent, it was still. Elias approached it, his hammer feeling like a child's toy. This was the impossibly heavy thing. This was what had shifted. He shined the light on the main shaft. It was thick as a man's torso, and it didn't end at a wall. It was angled down, disappearing through a perfectly bored tunnel in the granite, heading directly out under the seabed. "What are you?" he whispered. He reached out a trembling hand, the one that still had feeling, and laid it on the flywheel. The iron was not cold. It was warm. He snatched his hand back as if burned. The machine was not dead, it was dormant. He held his light steady, tracing the pistons. They were slick, not with water, but with a thick, black, viscous oil. And as he watched, he saw it. From the central gear housing, a single heavy drop of black oil welled up, hung for a moment, and then fell. It hit a small metal plate on the floor with a distinct, resonant thud. The sound from the bedroom. The book. The draft. That wasn't the wind. It was this. This thing, breathing in its sleep. He shined the light back on the main housing. He saw the brass plaque, greened with verdigris, but the name was still legible. Blackwood Marine and Salvage, 1888, hydraulic pumping system. A pump for what? He played the light along the shaft, back toward the flywheel, and then he saw the secondary mechanism he had missed. A smaller set of gears connected to a different shaft that went straight up, disappearing into the kitchen ceiling. Straight up, into the generator shed. Elias's blood ran cold. The generator wasn't his. The generator wasn't powering the house. The generator was powering this. The kid from Florida. Don't sleep, the insomnia. The rosary beads. He wasn't afraid of a ghost. He was afraid of this. He was here alone in the dark, feeding the machine. Elias backed away, his boot heel hitting the bottom step. And from the great silent flywheel, a low groan of metal on metal echoed in the cavern, as if it sensed his presence. The impossibly heavy thing was starting to wake up. The groan from the cavern was not a mechanical sound. It was deeper, more resonant, the sound of a whale amplified through stone. It was a noise of pressure and ancient weight. Elias Thorne fell backward, scrambling away from the open trapdoor. He landed hard on his hip, the impact sending a jolt of fire up his spine and into his bad shoulder. He didn't register the pain. His entire focus was on the black, gaping square in the kitchen floor. He was a man of stone and brick. He understood foundations. He understood solid earth. This was a violation of terms. From under the cot, Scrap's terror had changed. The high-pitched whining stopped, replaced by a frantic, desperate barking. It wasn't an attack. It was a plea. Get out, get out, get out. Elias used the wall to pull himself up. His bad knees buckled, but he locked them. The hammer was still in his hand, a 22-ounce paperweight against the thrumming, subterranean dread. He had to move. He couldn't stay in the cellar. He couldn't stay in the kitchen. He grabbed his phone from the floor where he dropped it. The flashlight beam was still on, a weak, pathetic cone. He slammed the heavy, slate-lined trapdoor shut. The boom of its seating was final, but there was no lock, no latch. The tremor came again, stronger this time. The groan returned and the floor vibrated, rattling the stacked, obsessive cans in the pantry. The generator, Elias said aloud, his voice sounding thin and alien in the room. The connection was immediate, brutal, and simple. The generator was powering the pump. The pump was waking up. The pump, and its terrifying, warm, alive presence, was the source of the noise, the fear, the carved warnings, the insomnia. The kid from Florida hadn't been afraid of a ghost. He had been afraid of the basement. Elias had a choice. He could stay in this kitchen, a prisoner between a barricaded hall and a rumbling floor, or he could cut the head off the snake. He grabbed his duffel, a primal instinct to gather his meager possessions. He grabbed his hammer. He moved to the generator shed, Scrap, now silent and trembling, glued to his heel. The shed was a concrete box, vibrating with the diesel engine's roar. The single bare bulb overhead cast a greasy, yellow light. The noise was a physical assault. It was the only thing Elias had trusted, his one link to the outside world, his one source of power. Now he saw it as the enemy's heart. He was not a mechanic, he was a builder, but he knew how to stop a machine. He found the main breaker panel, a heavy industrial steel box. He flipped every switch. The lights in the shed, the kitchen, the house, all dead. But the generator, a thing of pure, dumb power, kept roaring. It wasn't powering the lights. It was powering the pump. He looked for the kill switch. He found the fuel line, a thick rubber hose leading from the massive diesel tank to the engine block, and on it a heavy cast iron shut-off valve, its red paint chipped and rusted. He put his hands on it, his swollen, arthritic, useless hands. He tried to turn it. The valve didn't move. It was frozen, seized by salt, air, and disuse. The kid from Florida had been too terrified to even try this. Elias grunted, putting his shoulder into it. The metal was unforgiving. It bit into his palms, and a flash of white-hot pain made him cry out, his grip failing. His hands, his trade, his identity. They were betraying him. He was failing. The thrumming from the floor seemed to mock him. He looked at the hammer in his hand. He wasn't strong, not anymore. But he was smart. He was a tradesman. He knew leverage. He wedged the V-shaped claw of his brick hammer behind the valve handle. He slipped his trowel, his other tool, into the gap to create a better angle. It was a crude, desperate alignment. He put his boots on the generator's frame, and he pulled. He put his entire 180-pound weight, his grief, his anger, his frustration, into that one single motion. There was a sound like a gunshot, a crack of metal shattering rust. The valve turned. The effect was instantaneous. The generator, starved of fuel, coughed. Its rhythmic, powerful thrum faltered. It sputtered, choked, and then, with a long, dying whine, it went silent. The silence that flooded the room was absolute. It was a black, velvet, oppressive weight. The single bare bulb was dead. The kitchen was a black hole. Elias stood in the pitch dark, his chest heaving, listening to the tink-tink-tink of the cooling engine. He had done it. He had killed the machine. He stood for 1 second, two, three. He waited for the peace, for the quiet of the island to return. It did not. A new sound began. It was not the groan of the pump. It was the sound the pump had been hiding. It was a low, tearing, grinding sound. The sound of stone on stone, of a pressure being released. And then water. From the kitchen he heard it, a gush. The sound of 1,000 broken pipes, a sudden, violent, rushing cascade. Elias fumbled for his phone, his thumb finding the flashlight. He sprinted back into the kitchen, Scrap barking at his heels. He aimed the light at the trapdoor. Water, black and oily, was jetting from the cracks around the iron ring. It was pouring onto the linoleum floor, already forming a dark, spreading pool. No, he whispered. He had made a catastrophic, foundational error. The pump wasn't an intruder, it was a defender. The Blackwood Marine and Salvage plaque, the shaft disappearing under the sea, the weeping walls. The house was built below sea level. The machine wasn't a monster, it was a dike. It was the only thing keeping the North Atlantic out of the cellar. The kid from Florida wasn't driven mad by the noise. He was driven mad by the responsibility, by the endless, sleepless task of keeping the generator fed, keeping the pump alive, keeping the ocean at bay. Elias scrambled, slipping on the new wet floor. He shoved the 50-pound bags of flour onto the trapdoor, but it was useless. The water pressure was too great. The grinding sound returned, this time from the house itself. A groan of structural integrity failing. When he killed the engine, he had doomed the house. He backed away, his lights shaking, the water swirling around his ankles. He had to restart the generator. He had to fix this. He was halfway to the shed door when the trapdoor in the floor burst open. It didn't fly open. The pressure from below simply lifted it. The heavy slate-lined door rose on a column of churning, black seawater and then slid like a stone off a tomb into the pantry. A geyser of icy black ocean erupted into the kitchen, flooding the room in seconds. And in the center of that churning, watery void, Elias Thorne's flashlight beam found it. It wasn't the pump. It wasn't the sea. It was what the pump had been holding back. Rising from the hole, unfolding itself in the new deep water, was a shape. Something long and pale and impossibly articulate that had been living in the flooded darkness beneath the pump, waiting for the engine to finally stop. The water that erupted from the cellar was not just water. It was the deep ocean, pressurized, ancient, and impossibly cold. It struck Elias Thorne with the force of a physical blow, knocking him from his feet. The kitchen, his sterile sanctuary, became a churning, black pool in less than 10 seconds. He sputtered, the ice water shock momentarily paralyzing him. The flashlight on his phone, miraculously still in his hand, was now submerged, casting a weak, green, diffuse glow. His head broke the surface. The water was already 4 feet deep and rising, the generator shed now acting as a second inlet for the sea. The furniture, the cot, the desk, the nailed-down chair, was bobbing uselessly, crashing against the cabinets. "Scrap! Scrap!" he yelled. A frantic, terrified barking answered him. The dog, small and agile, had scrambled onto the butcher block counter, the room's last dwindling island. He was barking not at the water, but at the hole. Elias shoved his light above the surface, aiming it at the trapdoor. The thing he had seen was not a thing, it was many. Rising from the pressurized, churning hole were not tentacles. They were limbs, pale like the underbelly of a fish, and jointed, but in ways that defied biology. They were impossibly long, uncoiling from the deep, rising with the water. They weren't attacking, they were exploring. They moved with a slow, articulate grace, brushing the walls, testing the cabinets, tasting this new, air-filled world. One of them, pale and thin as a switch, brushed against Elias's submerged shoulder. The cold of it was absolute. It was a cold that burned, a cold that felt like a void. Elias screamed, a raw, choked sound, and scrambled backward. He was no longer a man. He was prey, in a tank of his own making. The house itself issued a groan, a deep, structural shudder of timber and stone surrendering. The water pressure from below was now being matched by the storm tide outside. The kitchen windows exploded inward, and the full force of the North Atlantic, a chaos of black water and ice, joined the flood. Elias was a bricklayer. He knew foundations. He knew failure. And this house was in its death throes. He had to get out. But how? The trap door was a portal to hell. The barricaded door to the main house was an impassable, submerged wall. The windows were now torrents of seawater. He was trapped. He was going to die here, in this black water, in this pantry of the damned. Then Scrap barked again, a sharp, insistent command. Elia's light, as he floundered, caught it. The stovepipe. The ancient, disconnected stovepipe in the corner. It wasn't a pipe, it was the flue. A brick-lined chimney ascending through the heart of the house. It was an escape route, a vertical one. He looked at his hands, the gnarled, useless claws that had failed him. He looked at the dog. "Okay," he grunted, "okay." He waded through the chest-deep water, the pale limbs now moving languidly all around him. He fought the current, shoving a floating cabinet out of his way. He reached the counter. Scrap, shivering, launched himself into Elias's arms, burrowing into his jacket. "Hold on, kid," Elias whispered, zipping the dog inside, a small, warm, trembling weight against his heart. He faced the flue. The cast-iron stove was long gone, leaving a black, soot-stained hole in the wall. He reached inside. It was narrow, but a man could fit. It was lined with brick, his oldest friend. He put his boot into a gap where a fire brick had fallen away. He grabbed a crossbar. He pulled. His shoulders screamed. He began to climb. It was the ascent from hell. He was climbing a vertical, rectangular tunnel in total darkness, with freezing water churning at his feet. The soot was thick, turning to a slick, icy mud on his hands. His hands, they were failing. His joints were on fire, the swollen knuckles grinding together. He couldn't grip. He was using his forearms, his elbows, bracing his back against the opposite wall. A long, pale limb, articulate and curious, slid into the flue below him, feeling its way up. Elias yelled, a sound of pure animal terror, and kicked. His boot connected with something that felt both hard and yielding, like refrigerated cartilage. The limb didn't recoil. It just paused. He climbed faster. He used the hammer. He swung the claw end into the mortar between bricks, creating a handhold, pulling himself up, foot by agonizing foot. Claw, pull, breathe, claw, pull, breathe. His hands were raw. He could feel the skin tear, the sharp bite of the cold on the open wounds. He didn't care. He was a builder, and he was unbuilding his tomb. The house screamed, a sound not of wind, but of structural collapse. The floor of the kitchen, his barricade, his world gave way. The entire room fell into the flooding cavern, taking the generator, the pantry, and the pale rising limbs with it, pulling it all back into the sea. The chimney flue he was in was now just a freestanding tower, the ocean roaring at its base. He climbed. He climbed until his arms were numb, until his lungs were burning, until he thought he would rather die than lift his hand one more time. He felt the wind. It wasn't a draft. It was the full, horizontal rage of the nor'easter. He looked up, a circle of gray, storm-tossed sky. He reached the top, his bloody fingers gripping the chimney cap. He hauled his body over the edge, collapsing onto the steep, slated roof. He was a sodden, broken wreck, but he was out. He lay on his back, the freezing rain and sleet hitting his face, and he laughed. A dry, painful, breathless sound. He unzipped his jacket. Scrap wriggled out, licked the blood and soot from Elias's face, and then sneezed, shaking his whole body. Elias sat up, his back to the chimney stack for warmth, and surveyed his new kingdom. It was a ruin. The island was being consumed. The main house was a dark, hollowed-out carcass, waves breaking through its empty windows. He and Scrap were alive, but stranded on the highest point of a sinking rock, in a blizzard. He pulled the dog close, wrapping his torn jacket around the small, shivering body. "We're not gonna freeze, kid," he muttered, though he knew it was a lie. Not yet. He had survived the house. He would not survive the night. He closed his eyes. He had done all he could. He drifted, the cold a merciful anesthetic. Then Scrap started barking. Not the terrified bark, not the warning bark. A new, curious sound. Elias forced his eyes open. The storm was breaking. The sky in the east was a bruised, watery gray. It was dawn. And he heard it. Not the wind, not the sea, not the pump. A deep, rhythmic thwump, thwump, thwump. He looked, his vision blurry. A bright, obtrusive, beautiful orange dot was pounding its way through the gray clouds. A Coast Guard helicopter. It wasn't looking for him. It was heading to him. Elias stared, confused. Then he understood. The lawyers. Creed and Finch. The generator. It wasn't just a power source. It was a leash. A dead man's switch. When the generator and the pump went silent, it must have sent a distress signal. An automatic failure alarm. Elias Thorne, who had tried to disappear from the world, had accidentally triggered a high-priority rescue. The helicopter hovered, its downdraft nearly tearing him from the roof. A harness descended. A man in a rescue suit waved. Elias looked at his hands. They were ruined, bloody, frozen, and mangled. But they had worked. They had held on. He tucked Scrap securely back into his jacket, grabbed the harness with his one good elbow, and let the sky pull him away from the island. Thank you so much for following Elias and Scrap on this journey. This story was a dark one, and you stuck with it to the end. Now I have a question for you. When Elias killed the generator, was he making a mistake based on fear, or was he unconsciously choosing to confront the thing he'd been running from his entire life?